I should note to begin with that I have a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to refer to it. Ever was it thus? Talking about this being a moment for reform. I should say that this is about 30 years to the day that Paul Volcker's National Commission on the Public Service issued its report, calling for action to address what we framed out as the quiet crisis. At the time, we could see markers of decay in administrative systems. The commission, which I worked for a brief moment in the wake of an emergency dealing with the deputy director who passed suddenly, the commission decided to frame this out as an argument around the need for immediate action on a number of different fronts. 30 years later, we see that many of the trends that were identified in the report have, of course, worsened, leading us again to say that this crisis is here, it's irreparable, it must be addressed, and the hope is that perhaps in an election run-up that we could bring this to the fore. In my discussion here today, I've identified 6 hazards, actually, that face the federal bureaucracy and that really came to the fore in recent weeks with the shutdown. We started to see some things manifest themselves in terms of the discussion about what was going on with the shutdown and its ultimate effects, whether in losses to GDP, problems recruiting the next generation of federal employees, delivery of services in broken bureaucracies, the remarkable slowdown in the appointment of senior officers in this administration, the gaps, and so forth in delivery. So I identify at least 6 hazards that have manifested themselves and that are pretty serious. And I would argue, and I have argued, off the quiet crisis, that the shutdown has really brought that crisis to a roar. We can see it, we can discuss it, and let me just run through quickly these 6 hazards. We've got an aging workforce, and the millennials have been waiting with bated breath for the baby boomers to get out, and we are seeing it happen. The last 2 quarters before the shutdown, we saw a remarkable increase, or a signal at least, a 25% increase in the number of retirements in the federal workforce. We're going to see that accelerate. We've been talking about this quiet crisis, the silver tsunami, as some people call it. I'm not wild about that description, being silver. Yes, that would be us. That we're seeing it happen, and we know that the baby boomers are going to leave. We don't see similar patterns yet in nonprofit land, where we have a large number of grantees who deliver goods and services on the federal government's behalf, and we can't tell what's happening within the very large workforce of contractors who deliver services, goods and services on the federal government's behalf, but we do see it in growing skill gaps within the federal government, and we know that the baby boomers are going to leave. That's an opportunity for us to reimagine the federal career and to develop new approaches to granting discretion to senior officers in the federal government. We're going to have to address it one way or the other. We've also got aging backbones in governments, the core management systems that drive action. Many of these systems, whether it's in procurement or information management, recruitment, personnel, we see deep skill gaps where we are just unable to develop reasonable approaches to managing government activities. We have aging hierarchies. The federal hierarchy has never had more layers of managers nor more leaders per layer. We are 71 layers from the bottom of government between the top and bottom of government. I know that because I count titles. And people will say, well, there can't really be an associate assistant Deputy Attorney General. Can there? Well, Google it. You'll find the current occupant. And many of those positions at the very top are currently vacant. Trump complained at great length of having too many people over people over people, but has done nothing to remove the layers that are now empty, and therefore policy gets strangled on the way up. We've got aging organizations. It's been a long time since we lost the reorganization authority that might have let presidents move more quickly to reform government or to rationalize government. It's been a much longer time since we actually took on government reform. Herbert Hoover was the last leader of a major reform commission to deal with this. I'm not saying the answer is another Hoover commission, but we might think about it. We've also got aging statutes. Many of the core operating statutes in the federal government are now 30, 40, 50 years old. There's nothing wrong with being 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, but we might want to take a look at some of those statutes. Civil Service Reform Act, 1978. A number of major statutes that regulate procurement and so forth need revision. Finally, we've got aging dividing lines. We have a very large blended workforce in the federal government, contractors, grantees, and civil servants. We often talk about the civil service as if it resides in a vacuum, but we've now stitched together a workforce that is quite complicated, imperative in many ways, imperative use of contractors and grantees to get the jobs done. But we need to sort things out. The Obama administration made a very aggressive effort to define some key terms in this debate, but we didn't get very far with it in the final analysis. I argue that these trends are coming together and can now be seen as a source of increasing public demand for very major government reform. Very major being a term that we use in our surveys of public opinion about the need for government reform. This country may be deeply divided between red and blue on many issues, but right now about 65% of Americans agree that the federal government needs very major reform. They're not necessarily in agreement on what that reform should be, other than getting rid of the other party, removing it from power. But we now see that Americans have come to agreement. Thanks for those extra seconds. I really appreciate it. Inside humor here. At any rate, we see that Americans are demanding reform, and I can broadly predict that the next election will involve a toe-to-toe battle between Donald Trump and his dismantlers, who want less government, smaller government, and very major reform, and the rebuilders, who do not yet have a candidate, who want bigger government, more services, and very major reform. It's very major reform that may prove important in determining who gets the presidency in 2020.